Thumb, 1855, the city frozen forever. What if a city could freeze its final breath in time, leaving behind a landscape so silent that even the wind seems afraid to speak? From the very first moment you step into the remains of Animas Fork, something feels wrong, not dangerous, not threatening, but disturbingly suspended, as if the mountains themselves refuse to let the place finish dying. This strange, frozen stillness is the detail that most visitors overlook. People see abandoned buildings and collapsed roofs, but few notice how unnaturally untouched the town feels, as though events stopped mid-story, leaving questions hanging in the air, begging anyone brave enough to lean closer. And that is where the real mystery begins. Not with what Animas Fork became, but why it seems determined to stay exactly as it was the moment everyone walked away. Animas Fork was not supposed to exist forever, yet the deeper you look, the more it feels like it insists on doing just that. The mountains surrounding it rise like walls, isolating the valley from every direction, creating a natural bowl that traps snow, storms, and apparently history itself. Long before the final winter sealed its fate, people sensed the weight of this place. Diaries mention nights where the silence felt too heavy, mornings when footprints vanished despite clear skies, and storms that arrived without warning, as if the landscape controlled its own weather. These small details, dismissed at the time, now pull U.S. toward a darker question: was Animas Fork shaped by human ambition, or was something else sculpting its story from the shadows? The city's birth was a collision between desperation and hope. Miners arrived chasing silver veins rumored to run deep beneath the mountains, but what they found was a land that gave and took with equal cruelty. The altitude made breathing difficult. The cold anchored itself into every wall, every tool, every joint, yet people stayed. They built houses, stores, and cabins with an almost frantic determination, as if proving they could conquer a place that nature itself seemed reluctant to host. And this conflict between human will and environmental dominance created the perfect tension, because every victory the settlers claimed only made the eventual collapse feel more inevitable. You can almost sense the story tightening around them, step by step. What makes Animas Fork so unsettling today is not the decay but the preservation. Wooden beams that should have rotted decades ago remain eerily intact. Windows, though cracked, still frame the same mountain skyline residents once stared at. It is as if the town is holding its breath, refusing to let go of the moment everything stopped. And here is where the mystery deepens. Objects left behind suggest people fled in a rush, yet there are no signs of widespread destruction, no burned homes, no clear traces of violence or catastrophe. Instead, the abandonment feels quiet to quiet lack an evacuation. Nobody had time to understand. Why would a community simply vanish from a place they fought so hard to build? Some believe the answer lies in the winter of 1884, remembered not through official records but through fragmented account stories of temperatures that plunged lower than any measured before, storms that buried entire cabins, and nights when even the most experienced miners refused to step outside. According to several journals, something strange happened during those weeks. Tools froze solid inside homes, food spoiled overnight, and entire sections of the valley sank under layers of ice so dense they cracked like glass. Many residents interpreted this as nothing more than extreme weather, but others wrote that it felt like the mountains wanted us gone. Statements like these were ignored as superstition, yet when we revisit them now, they form a pattern difficult to dismiss. The tension grew, day by day, until the isolation became unbearable. Imagine being trapped in a valley where every patho is choked with snow, where every window shows the same endless white, where every night feels a little longer than the one before. People began talking about leaving, some quietly, others desperately. But leaving was never simple. The mountain passes closed early that year, and rumors spread of small groups who tried to escape and never returned. Their names faded into local lore, becoming part of the town's whispered legacy, and whether those tales were exaggerated or not, the fear they created was real enough to push the remaining population toward a decision that no one could reverse once set in motion. What happened next is the moment where Animas Fork's story freezes into something that feels almost staged, as if time itself snapped. The final departure, the last walk down the snow-choked street, the shutting of doors that would never be opened again. And the strangest part, no definitive record explains why the final families left simultaneously. No. Officia noci no council decision, just a collective act of surrender to a force none of them seemed able or willing to describe. This is the detail that hooks historians, travelers, and curious minds, even today. The sense that something drove the town to abandon itself, something relentless, yet strangely quiet. And as we move deeper into this story, we begin to see patterns that echo in other abandoned towns across the world. Patterns that suggest Animas Fork may not be an isolated mystery. After all, and if this story is already pulling you in, take a moment to share what you think might have pushed an entire community to leave everything behind. Comment your first theory below, because understanding how these mysteries unfold is what keeps this investigation alive. And while you are here, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you do not miss the hidden layers behind abandoned places like Animas Fork. Your engagement helps this story reach more people who love unraveling dark history as much as you do. The story of Animas Fork shifts dramatically the moment we examine how the town was born, because its creation was not the result of gradual settlement, but a sudden, almost desperate surge of human ambition. In the mid-date hundreds, prospectors swept through the San Juan Mountains with an intensity bordering on obsession. Driven by rumors that silver veins thick as tree roots cut through the rock beneath the snow, these men were not builders or dreamers in the traditional sense. They were risk-takers, gamblers, and wanderers who believed fortune waited for those willing to suffer for it. And Animas Fork quickly became a magnet for exactly that type of spirit. At more than 11,000 feet of elevation, the settlement rose like a challenge to nature, a claim staked in a place where the air thins, storms move with predatory speed, and winter is never more than a step away. What is most striking is how fast the town grew despite the brutal environment. Within a few years, dozens of cabins appeared, followed by shops, saloons, and a post office. It was as if people were racing unseen pressure, trying to outbuild the landscape before it pushed back. Diaries from early residents describe mornings when frost coated the inside of windows even during summer, and nights when the wind screamed through the valley with such force that roofs seemed ready to tear off. Yet instead of leaving, more families arrived. They brought children, livestock, and belief that prosperity could tame the mountains. This tension between optimism and danger is crucial, because from the very beginning, Animas Fork existed in a fragile balance, one strong storm away from disaster, one failed mine away from collapse. But beneath the enthusiasm lay cracks that would widen over time. The town's geography created challenges no one truly solved. The only routes in and out twisted along narrow, avalanche-prone paths. Supplies arrived late, when they arrived at all. Anyone who fell ill had to rely on improvised care or hope the weather lifted long enough for a doctor to reach them. Strangely, these conditions did not deter settlement, they amplified it. Something about the harshness strengthened the town's identity. Residents spoke of an unspoken pact: survive together or not at all. Yet this same unity masked a growing undercurrent of unease. Miners reported strange vibrations under the ground, as if the mountain shifted restlessly beneath their feet. Others mentioned hearing distant cracking sounds at night, like ice breaking in thick sheets even when temperatures were mild. These testimonies might sound like exaggerations born from isolation, but they become more intriguing when compared across different accounts. Different families, different months, different parts of the valley, yet similar descriptions kept appearing. The mountain felt alive, restless, unpredictable. Some settlers claimed the air carried a metallic smell before certain storms, as though the earth warned them to stay inside. Children whispered about seeing flickers of movement near the tree line, shapes swallowed by snow before adults could verify them. These stories were not widespread enough to cause alarm, but they settled into local lore, seeds of doubt that would later take root when circumstances grew darker. Economically, Animas Fork thrived. The mines produced steady yields, enough to support saloons filled with laughter and streets busy with merchants. But success brought its own strain. More miners meant deeper tunnels, harsher working conditions, and accidents that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Kevin's gas pockets and sudden drops in temperature underground created a sense that the environment was pushing back harder than before. Some blamed poor management, others blamed greed, but a few looked to the mountains and whispered that they had taken too much too quickly, whether symbolic or literal. That idea lingered. Perhaps the valley allowed prosperity only for a price no one had calculated yet. Then came the turning point. Subtle at first, winters began arriving earlier, lasting longer, and hitting harder. Temperatures reached records even longtime residents had never experienced. Livestock froze standing up, Trees split down their trunks with noises like gunfire. Several cabins collapsed under snowpacks thicker than any measured before. And with each extreme winter, a new pattern emerged. The town bounced back slower, repairs took longer, and morale dropped visibly. It was during this period that people began leaving quietly, not in mass evacuation, but in small, unnoticed withdrawals. A young couple disappeared one October, intending to reach a neighboring settlement before the snows. Their wagon was found months later, buried and icy, but they were not. Another family vanished the following spring, their belongings still arranged neatly inside their cabin. Explanations varied wild. Animals, accident, exposure, but none felt fully convincing. This slow unraveling formed a quiet backdrop to the story long before the infamous final winter. Animas Fork was changing, and its residents felt the shift, even if they struggled to explain it. Hope turned cautious, daily routines became survival strategies, and conversations around the fireside grew more anxious. The same men who once joked about the unforgiving mountain now stared at it with wariness. The valley no longer felt like a frontier full of opportunity. It felt like a narrowing corridor, a place tightening around them. Yet despite everything, many refused to abandon their home. Pride, attachment, and a belief that the worst had already passed kept them anchored. Little did they know that the real, collapsed quiet, coordinated, and deeply unsettling was approaching faster than anyone realized. The origins of Animas Fork hold the clues, but understanding the collapse requires looking at the subtle signs of residents. Try to ignore it until it was too late. By the time winter of 1884 arrived in Animas Fork, the town's resilience had worn thin. As if the very land had grown tired of the people it had reluctantly allowed to settle. The landscape, which had once seemed brimming with possibility, now appeared as an inescapable trap. For those who had managed to endure the isolation, the continuous snowstorms, and the oppressive cold, the idea of a brutal winter was nothing new. But this one felt different. There was something strange in the air, a foreboding quality that even the most hardened miners couldn't shake off. Something was coming, and they couldn't stop it. The first sign of trouble arrived in early November, when an unusual weather pattern emerged. Storm clouds rolled in without warning, and temperatures dropped so quickly that even seasoned residents were caught off guard. No one was prepared for how fast the snow accumulated. The mountain passos, already treacherous, became impassable. Roads, once cleared with relative ease, were now covered by layers of thick, unrelenting ice. Supply trains, the lifeblood of the town's commerce, couldn't reach Animas Fork. The food and provisions they had were dwindling. But even worse was the eerie stillness that accompanied each passing day. The wind howled through the canyon like an animal in pain, and the snow seemed to fall in heavier sheets, coating everything in a dense, unyielding silence. As the snow began to build up, something else started happening. Unexplained vibrations underfoot. Miners who had spent years working in the deep shafts below reported that the ground seemed to shudder, ever so slightly, as if the mountains were shifting their weight. The vibrations were subtle at first, so subtle that most dismissed them as the aftershocks of nearby avalanches or the natural settling of the landscape. But over Chimi, these tremors grew stronger, making even the most stable structures tremble. It was no longer a matter of when the storms would stop. It was a question of whether they could survive long enough to see it end. The air grew heavy in the way that only a real storm can make it feel, pressing down, suffocating. There were reports of faint metallic smells, the kind of scent that clings to your lungs only to dissipate before you can figure out its source. On the surface, these changes might have been dismissed as just another series of oddities in a harsh environment. But to those who lived in Animas Fork, they felt like signs, portents, warning of something worse. Something was coming. Something they couldn't see yet, but could feel in every creaking floorboard, every howling gust of wind. Families began retreating into their homes earlier and earlier each day. What had once been a lively community now seemed to shrink as isolation deepened. There were whispers around the campfires of strange figures spotted near the edges of the town, shadowy shapes that would disappear the moment anyone tried to approach. Whether these were just the products of overworked minds or something more sinister, no one could be sure. But even the most skeptical residents began to wonder if the town's fate was no longer in their hands. By late December, the situation in Animas Fork had become dire. The snow didn't stop falling, and the temperature dropped even further. It was as if the town was being buried alive, smothered under an avalanche of nature's indifference. The once bustling saloon was silent, its windows frozen shut by layers of ice. The post office, the lifeblood of communication for those trying to keep in touch with the outside world, had become nothing more than a darkened, forgotten building. Food rations ran low, and residents were forced to survive on whatever they could hunt or forage. But the mountains had become a hostile wilderness, no longer a place of fortune and opportunity, but a vast, unwelcoming expanse that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. It was during this time of growing desperation that the first real tragedy struck. A group of men, determined to leave the valley before the snows trapped them completely, set out for a neighboring town. They never returned. Their disappearance remains one of the most chilling mysteries of Animas Fork. What happened to them? Did they fall victim to the elements? Or was there something more insidious at play? The details are sketchy at best, but the residents of Animas Fork were never the same after. That the town, already fragile, began to fracture even further. Trust evaporated, replaced by a creeping fear that something unseen, something ancient, was slowly tightening its grip on them. Then came the moment that sealed the town's fate. The mountains, which had once been a source of fortune, now became the very thing that claimed Animas Fork. The snowstorm of 1884 reached its crescendo in January, when temperatures plummeted to unbearable lows. A series of avalanches buried the valley, trapping those who had remained inside their homes. The town was now completely cut off from the world. Communication stopped, hope faded, and then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the storm stopped. But Animas Fork was already sealed away in time, left to be forgotten by the world. What makes this story even more unsettling is the fact that even now, all these years later, Animas Fork still exists in some strange, unexplainable way. It stands frozen like an artifact from another time, holding its breath while the world moves on. No one can fully explain why the town was abandoned so suddenly, or why the mountains seemed to demand it. But what is clear is that Animas Fork didn't simply disappear, it chose to be forgotten. From the outside, the collapse of Animas Fork seemed sudden, almost theatrical. But the truth is that the town had been whispering its warnings long before the final days arrived. The residents simply didn't realize what those warnings meant, or perhaps they didn't want to realize it. When you look closely at the scattered diaries, broken ledgers, and fragments of correspondence that survived the abandonment, a strange pattern emerges. Small incidents, strange signs, subtle shifts in the environment, all dismissed at first as ordinary hardships of mountain life. But when these fragments are pieced together, they reveal a story that feels less like coincidence and more like a sequence of events moving toward an unavoidable breaking point. It began, with the sound. Not the howling wind. Animas Fork was accustomed to that, but a deep rumble that seemed to come from within the mountain itself. At first, miners described it as a vibration too smooth to be thunder and too steady to be an avalanche. It didn't shake the buildings, but it made the floorboards hum softly beneath their feet. Some compared it to the resonance you feel when a distant train is approaching, except there were no tracks anywhere near the valley. Whenever someone stepped outside to investigate, the sound vanished as if the very act of looking for it scared it away. And then, when they retreated indoors, it returned, faint but deliberate, like a breath being held and released beneath the ground. This phenomenon would have been unsettling on its own, but it wasn't the only strange occurrence. There were reports of lanterns flickering simultaneously in different homes, even when there was no wind strong enough to penetrate their walls. Residents blamed the thin mountain air, faulty wicks, or batches of cheap kerosene, but the timing was odd lanterns dimming at the exact same moment, brightening again in unison. These were details too peculiar to ignore, yet too subtle to prove. Most residents simply carried on, unwilling to entertain the possibility that something beyond their understanding might be unfolding around them. Then there were the animals. Horses, once steady and reliable, became unpredictable. They refused to travel certain paths, bolting at shadows or freezing in place 4 minutes at a time, eyes fixed on something distant, something no human could see. Dogs howled through the night, not in response to foxes or wolves, but seemingly at the mountainsides themselves. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Livestock grew thin, despite normal feed. To the people of Animas Fork, animals had always been early detectors of danger, but even these signs were brushed aside as seasonal stress. It was easier to blame the weather than to consider the possibility that the mountains were shifting in ways they could not interpret. As the minor warnings accumulated, a deeper unease began spreading among the residents. Conversations grew quieter, People started locking their doors earlier. Families reported waking up in the middle of the night with the unsettling feeling that someone or something was walking outside. Footprints appeared in the snow that didn't match any known animal. Not large enough for a bear, not shaped like a deer, not spaced like a wolf. Some describe them as elongated, almost human, but with irregular spacing that suggested a gait unfamiliar to any creature in the region. They would appear at dawn and vanish by midday, erased by the shifting powder. Those who saw them debated silently whether to share what they'd witnessed, afraid of being dismissed or, worse, believed. Even more unnerving were the disappearances. They didn't start with people, they began with objects. Tools went missing from sheds, food, supplies vanished from well-sealed pantries. Wooden boards placed outside to dry were found rearranged in strange patterns. Shovels appeared miles from where they had been left. These oddities were easy to attribute to forgetfulness or mischief, until one morning a family awoke to find their front door wide open, despite a heavy iron latch that could not have slipped on its own. Snow had drifted inside in a narrow line, as if a single path had been created through the entryway. Yet no footprints marked the approach or the retreat. By now, the tension in Animas Fork had become a living thing. You could feel it in conversations that stopped abruptly when a gust of wind rattled the siding. You could see it in eyes that darted nervously toward the windows at dusk. Whatever force had unsettled the animals, darkened the lanterns, and rearranged the objects in the night seemed to be inching closer. The residents tried to make sense of the signs. Was the mountain collapsing? Internally, was someone sabotaging the town? Or was the environment itself expressing a warning more profound than any avalanche or storm? The truth is that no single event pushed Animas Fork over the edge. It was the accumulation, the steady layering of unease until the town felt like a pressure cooker of dread. What everyone had dismissed as isolated incidents revealed themselves to be interconnected pieces of a larger, darker picture. The unsettling part is how quiet it all was. There were no explosions, no fires, no mobs, just a gradual tightening of the invisible, a squeezing of the town's spirit until something finally gave way. And that quiet opening crack is what would soon lead to the night when Animas Fork crossed from a struggling settlement into a future ghost. The night everything changed in Animas Fork did not begin with panic. It began with an unsettling, unnatural stillness that settled over the valley like a blanket held too tightly over something struggling. Underneath, residents later described it as the quiet that comes before a storm, except there was no storm on the horizon, no clouds gathering, no wind heaving. The air was crisp, sharp, almost fragile. People stepped outside their cabins and found the world frozen in place. Even the usual sounds of wildlife, the distant cracking of ice, the rustling of trees were absent. It was as if the entire mountain range had collectively stopped breathing. Just after sunset, the temperature dropped faster than anyone in the town had ever experienced. Frost formed on windows in thick patterns resembling fractured glass, spreading in seconds instead of minutes. Horses stamped nervously in their stalls, their breath forming violent plumes in the air. Dogs whimpered without reason, ears pinned back, tails tucked low. The air had weight, as though something immense was pressing against the atmosphere. Families huddled inside, lighting extra lanterns, double-checking lattes, whispering prayers under their breath. They couldn't explain why, but everyone sensed the same thing. Tonight was different. Then, sometime near midnight, the sound returned, the low, vibrating hum that miners had mentioned weeks before, except this time it was louder, deeper, and impossible to ignore. It traveled through the floorboards, up the walls, into the chests of every person awake. It wasn't violent, but it carried a strange emotional charge. The kind of resonance that makes your heartbeat feel out of sync with your own body. People opened their doors to check the surroundings, only to find the world illuminated by an eerie bluish glow reflecting off the snow. No one knew its source. It was bright enough to see by, yet no lantern, moon, or flame created it. The glow appeared to come from the snow itself. In the distance, the mountains groaned. Long, slow, agonizing creaks echoed through the valley, followed by sharp cracks that bounced off the canyon walls. Avalanches, perhaps, yet the sound didn't match. Avalanches roar, thunder, explode. These noises were deliberate, segmented, almost rhythmic, as though enormous sheets of stone were sliding against each other in precise intervals. The residents watched the peaks with breathless dread, waiting for destruction to come sweeping down the slopes. But nothing fell. The mountains simply shifted in the dark like colossal animals adjusting their positions. Inside the homes, another phenomenon began unfolding. Objects trembled on shelves, not violently, but with a faint, pulsing movement. Lantern flames bent sideways despite there being no draft. Shadows elongated across the walls, stretching impossibly far, as if reaching for corners they had never touched before. For the first time, even the skeptics felt something primal stirring beneath the surface. Not superstition, not paranoia, instinct. The instinct that whispers when a predator is near. And then came the screams. Not humanate, at least not at first. A single animal cry tore through the silence, the kind that sends ice through your veins. Horses buckled in their stalls. Dogs bolted under furniture. Something had startled them with a fear they had never expressed before. Moments later, a second scream rang out, this time unmistakably human. A man burst from his cabin, stumbling barefoot into the snow, shouting that someone or something was pounding on his walls from the outside. His wife followed, clutching a lantern with shaking hands. Their breath turned into frantic clouds as they tried to explain what they'd seen. Dark shapes moving around their home, circling, leaving no footprints behind. Neighbors gathered, terrified, trying to decide whether to believe them. But before anyone could respond, another cabin door slammed open down the street. A woman ran into the road, sobbing, pointing to her window. She claimed she had seen eyes glowing white as the snow staring at her through the glass. They blinked once and then disappeared into the blue-tinged darkness. Panic spread with the speed of wildfire. Families grabbed coats, children, lanterns, anything they could carry. The hum beneath the ground grew stronger, now vibrating through the air itself, making each person's bones feel as though they were softly rattling. Some called for everyone to gather in the church. Others demanded they flee immediately. Arguments erupted. Fists slammed against doors. People searched desperately for weapons that would make no difference against something they couldn't see. And as confusion took over, the glow in the snow intensified. Not gradually, violently, flashing in a single burst of brilliant blue-white light that blinded everyone for an instant. When the light faded, an unnatural fog rolled into the valley, low and dense, slithering along the ground like a living thing. It swallowed the streets, obscuring homes, narrowing visibility to barely an arm's length. Voices shouted from within the haze, disoriented, calling for loved ones. Several people claimed the fog whispered back. No one recorded exactly what happened in the chaos that followed, because every account contradicts the others in chilling ways. Some say the fog revealed figures walking silently between the cabins. Others swear the ground opened in small cracks that closed just as quickly. A few insist they heard children laughing somewhere in the mist, though none were outside. Whatever occurred, it pushed the town past the breaking point. The moment the fog thinned enough to see 10 feet ahead, a collective decision formed without anyone speaking it aloud. They had to leave. But the final mystery of that night isn't the glow, the hum, or the fog, it's what happened afterward. When morning came, the valley was silent again. Calm, frozen. No damage, no footprints. No signs of the chaos that had erupted mere hours before. It was as if the night had been swallowed whole, erased by something that preferred to leave no proof behind. By the time dawn broke over Animas Fork, the previous night felt almost unreal, as if the darkness had swallowed the chaos and left behind a counterfeit version of the town. The fog had vanished. The strange glow had faded. The humming beneath the ground had gone completely silent. Cabins stood exactly where they had always been, undisturbed and eerily neat, as though whatever had moved through the valley hours earlier had deliberately erased its tracks. But the people who had lived through it knew better. The stillness wasn't comforting, it was accusatory, as if the mountains were waiting for their reaction. Families gathered in the street, clutching blankets and lanterns, exchanging fragments of memories they couldn't piece into a full picture. Some remembered voices in the fog. Others recalled seeing figures watching from the tree line. A few swore they had been touched by something cold brushing past them in the darkness. Yet no two stories matched, and every attempt to create a logical version of The night collapsed under contradictions. What everyone could agree on was simpler. Staying felt dangerous in a way they couldn't explain, and leaving suddenly felt urgent. But leaving Animas Fork was never simple. The mountain passes were buried under layers of ice and snow, practically sealing the town inside a natural prison. Men tested the trails leading south, only to return pale and shaken, claiming they felt watched the entire time. One said he heard footsteps following him, crunching the snow in perfect rhythm with his own butt, stopping the moment he stopped. Another reported seeing impressions forming in the snow a few yards behind him, as if something invisible walked the same path. Inside the town, tension tightened with every passing hour. Children refused to sleep unless lanterns stayed lit. Animals remained restless, refusing food, pacing in tight circles as though anticipating another event. The residents sensed something unfinished, something that Hadanti had revealed. Its last move. It wasn't just fear. It was an awareness, a collective intuition that the previous night had been a warning, not the climax. That afternoon, a strange discovery pushed the town closer to collapse near the edge of the valley, where the fog had been thickest. Several perfectly round patches of snow had melted into smooth, glassy depressions. They weren't natural, they looked almost sculpted, as if heat had been applied in precise circles without affecting the surrounding snow. Footprints led to or from them. When touched, the surfaces were warm. No explanation made sense. Not weather, not wildlife, not human. People began whispering about forces they didn't dare name. Some claimed the mountains were awakening. Others believed something ancient beneath the ground had risen, and a few insisted the town itself was reacting to the decades of mining carved deep into its core, as if the land were tired of being carved open. By evening, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Whatever had visited them during the night fog, sound, presence, or something else entirely, it wasn't finished. And the residents realized they were running out of time to choose whether they would flee or wait for the next sign. The next night, the next unknown chapter of a story they no longer controlled. The tension inside Animas Fork had reached a point where even breathing felt different, as if the air itself resisted being pulled into the lungs. After the strange depressions in the snow were discovered, the residents tried to pretend life could continue as usual. They repaired fences, shoveled paths, and tended to the animals, but every action felt hollow, mechanical, performed by people whose minds were no longer in the present. They weren't living in the town anymore. They were waiting inside it. That night, the temperature dropped again, but this time, the cold carried a deliberate quality, almost calculated. Windows frosted over from the inside. Wooden beams groaned under sudden pressure changes, and then, in the middle of this thickening quiet, a noise echoed through the street's 3 sharp knocks, spaced evenly apart, hitting the valley like a signal. Some swore it came from the old general store. Others insisted it came from every cabin at once. No one dared investigate. Inside their homes, families pressed their palms against the walls and felt faint vibrations pulsing through the wood. Not shaken pulsing, like a heartbeat too. Slow to belong to anything living. What unsettled them most was how synchronized it felt, as though the entire structure of the town was vibrating to the same rhythm, responding to a force no one could see. Children cried without understanding why. Adults exchanged looks that expressed more fear than words ever could. The next morning brought another discovery that pushed the town past its final threshold. Overnight, markings had appeared on several door frames. Thin, precise scratches arranged in patterns no one recognized, some forming straight vertical lines. Others curved like hooks or spirals. They weren't random. They weren't made by animals. They looked intentional, and yet there were no footprints, no signs of tampering, no broken legs. Residents began accusing each other, not out of suspicion, but out of desperation to attach the fear to something human. Accusations dissolved quickly, replaced by the horrifying realization that they couldn't find a single explanation that made sense. The markings didn't threaten, they predicted. They gave the impression of being placed with purpose, like symbols left by something studying the town rather than attacking it. By midday, a quiet consensus formed. People moved through the streets in hushed voices, packing items without announcing their decisions. It wasn't an evacuation, it was surrender. They weren't leaving because they had a plan, they were leaving because staying had become impossible. Whatever had touched their homes, watched their windows, and scraped symbols into the wood wasn't done. The town could feel it, and its people were no longer willing to wait for the next sign. Before the sun set, groups began making preparations to depart at dawn. They swore they would leave together for safety, but everyone knew what that meant. One last night inside a valley that no longer wanted them. What do you think those symbols on the doors represented? Leave your interpretation. Below, I'm curious what patterns you see in them. The final night before the planned departure carried a heaviness, unlike any the town had felt before. Animas Fork seemed aware of their decision as, though the valley itself sensed movement building beneath the surface. The wind didn't blow. Snow didn't fall. Even the animals, usually restless in the cold, lay silent, as if waiting for an unseen command. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't calm. It warns. Many residents gathered in small groups, unwilling to be alone. They whispered theories in circles lit by shaky lanterns, that the symbols carved into the doors marked households, that something had been tracking them for years, that the mining tunnels had awakened a force buried deep in the mountain. Every idea sounded both absurd and terrifying, yet none could be dismissed outright. In a place where the fog behaved like a living thing and snow glowed from within, logic no longer offered shelter. As midnight approached, an unexpected sound rolled across the valley, silence breaking. It was a soft crack, subtle but penetrating, like ice fracturing beneath pressure. It didn't come from the mountains this time. It came from the earth beneath the town. People felt the vibration rise through the floorboards, stronger than before, enough to rattle windows and sway lantern flames. The pulse repeated, slower and slower, echoing into the night like a fading heartbeat. Then the lights went out. Not just lanterns inside homes, every visible source of light seemed to dim at once, even flames burning inside metal stoves. The darkness carried weight, pressing in from all directions, making the valley feel smaller, tighter. For a brief moment, no one moved. And then someone screamed. The fog returned. It seeped back into the town like a tide coming in, too fast to outrun. Rolling between buildings, curling around doorways, swallowing the outlines of homes one by one. But this fog behaved differently from the one before. It didn't just obscure, vision it, distorted it. People standing a few feet apart saw each other stretch and blur, as though the air itself were bending. Shadows elongated into impossible shapes. Sound warped, making footsteps echo backward or sideways. Some residents tried to flee their cabins, only to freeze at the sight of figures moving within the fog. Not approaching, observing, dark silhouettes stood in stillness, their shapes shifting subtly, as if wrapped in smoke rather than flesh. They didn't attack. They didn't speak. They watched. A family attempting to reach the center of town later claimed the silhouettes parted deliberately to let them pass, like spectators observing a procession. Others insisted the figures mimicked their movements, copying gestures a second too late, like reflections lagging behind their sources. And then, as quickly as it came, the fog receded, dissolving into the air until only the faintest traces remained. But it left something behind. The realization that whatever inhabited the valley was not threatening them. Out of malice, it was responding to them, studying them, predicting them, perhaps preparing for something they weren't meant to witness. When sunrise finally touched the mountain peaks, the town gathered at the edge of the valley in shaken silence. They did not speak of what they saw. They didn't need to. What mattered was simple. They could not spend one more night in Animas Fork. What do you think those watching figures truly wanted? Share your thoughts if something stands out to you. The day they left Animas Fork was not marked by a rush of panic, but by an unsettling quiet. The fog had lifted, the town was finally visible again, but something had changed in the landscape that no one could describe in clear terms. The mountain, once a distant challenge, now seemed closer, intimate, almost invasive, as though it had taken a personal interest in the people who had dared to carve out a life in its grasp. The residents packed their belongings in hurried but practiced motions, eyes darting to the edges of the town where the fog had lingered. Some carried rifles, though no one knew why. There were no threats to fight, no immediate danger they could see. And yet, every step felt like a retreat, like they were running from a memory too fresh to forget. Even the animals seemed subdued, their ears flat, their eyes wide, unwilling to look at anything that lay beyond the valley. As they began the slow journey down the path to safety, the mountains behind them became more than just a backdrop. They loomed over the town like silent sentinels, watching as the people who had once dared to settle there, leaving only their belongings, memories, and unanswered questions behind. The journey out was harder than expected. What had been passable trails only days before were now choked with deep snow, and each step forward seemed to push the hikers further away from the civilization they once knew. The road grew steeper, the mountains pressing in harder, as if the land itself resented the idea of their departure. At one point, a group of residents lost their way, circling back around to find themselves standing on the same trail they'd left just hours earlier. That night, the stars disappeared behind a fresh layer of clouds, and the winds picked up, moving the snow like a blanket over the land. The oddest part, none of the people on that journey could remember what caused them to turn back. The town behind them now felt like something half-remembered, a place that hadn't yet relinquished its hold, even though its inhabitants were far beyond its reach. The figures in the fog, the strange vibrations, the symbols on the doorsteps were not things easily forgotten. They would stay with them, silently gnawing at their thoughts, popping up in idle moments when their minds wandered back to that cursed valley. And yet, as they moved farther from Animas Fork, a strange peace settled over the group. Perhaps it was the realization that the town was behind them, or perhaps it was simply the belief that the valley would remain locked away, hidden beneath snow and mountains, as it had always been. No one was quite sure. It wasn't until much later that the real horror became clear. Animas Fork had not disappeared. It had been forgotten by all but those few who lived there. Stories of the place faded into myth. Records were lost, deliberately erased, until all that remained were faint whispers on the wind and ghostly images in the minds of those who escaped. But the town itself had not been erased from the earth. It had merely been left behind, to be remembered only by those few who dared enter its depths and who knew better than to look back. What do you think happened to those who were left behind? Was Animas Fork a trap or something more? Feel free to leave your theories below. The legend of Animas Fork, like so many ghost towns, holds a magnetic pull on the curious. And yet, the more we uncover, the more unsettling the questions become. What happened to the people who disappeared into the valley? Why did the land itself seem to demand a retreat, only to let the town linger, frozen in Chimi? As the years pass, the story of Animas Fork becomes less about what was left behind and more about what was never meant to be discovered. In the years following the evacuation, a strange quiet settled over the abandoned town. People who returned to explore or search for lost items reported something odd. The place never seemed to deteriorate in the usual way. While the wood inside cabins cracked and splintered, the buildings themselves remained largely intact. Windows never fully shattered. Walls didn't sag under the weight of time. It was as though the valley was protecting its secret, preventing time from claiming what had been left behind. But in the minds of those who knew the town's story, something else was happening, something more troubling. Animas Fork wasn't just a place abandoned by people. It was a place abandoned by history itself. It was as if the world had purposefully excised the town from its memory. Few people remembered the exact names of the families that once lived there. Some who tried to study it were met with vague references or incomplete documents. What could have happened to erase a place so completely? The most disturbing thing about Animas Fork is how it remains suspended between myth and reality. What happened to the people who live there is still largely unknown. Did they truly disappear, or were they swallowed up by something more sinister? Something that remains hidden beneath the layers of snow and time? Were they simply victims of nature's unforgiving grip? Or was there something more at work, some darker force that played a part in the town's fate? These questions linger unanswered. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Animas Fork isn't the town itself, but the fact that it seems to resist being forgotten. The place is still there, waiting in the mountains, its secrets buried under snow and stone. As the years pass, the story of Animas Fork will only grow more mysterious, as new generations come to uncover fragments of what was left behind. But no one will ever know the full story, not the way those who lived it did. And so the town remains a place frozen in time, a ghost, a legend, a puzzle with no solution. If you have any theories about what really happened, feel free to share them in the comments. Do you think the town was cursed? Or is there something more? The mystery of Animas Fork will never truly be solved. If you've made it this far, don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts. Give a like if you enjoyed the journey, and make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. And if you're still curious about other lost towns and hidden histories, check out the next video right here on the screen. It's just the beginning.